Son, and of the Holy Spirit. O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, Lord, everywhere present, and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life. Come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls, O good one. Amen.
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 So,
Christian, should I just leave my little square here where I
Fine. Sure.
Yeah.
Ah, Richard, hello.
Hello, can you see me?
Nope.
I need to click something on here.
It says there's a little video camera down below
Down below?
on the bottom right or bottom left.
Okay.
Oh, start video.
Okay, here I am. Yeah, that's great.
All right.
Hello.
Very good.
You recording, Frank?
Yes, it's recording now.
Okay. So basically what I want to talk about tonight is the utter chaos that the American church fell into in the 1920s. You remember up until 1917, everything basically was running fairly smoothly. The diocese was, composed of a synod of bishops. You had various bishops assigned to various ethnicities to consolidate those communities. There was a bishop in Alaska. There's Bishop Raphael in Hawaii, and in Brooklyn, of course. New York was the seat of the Archbishop, Metropolitan, and then they were developing episcopal sees for other bishops as well. There was going to be a Greek bishop from Galveston, and there was the Serbian bishop who he was originally from San Francisco, but I'm not sure. I think the plan had been to put him in Chicago, and things basically were going pretty well, and there was unity. Not all of the Greek communities had anything to do with the Russian Archdiocese. Some of them were just independent. Some of them looked to Athens. Some of them looked to Constantinople, and some of them looked to nobody and refused any episcopal oversight. But there were also those Greek communities under the Russian episcopate or under the Russian diocese. And this was the fully canonical foundation of the American church. Of course, it had started in Sitka in 1840. It then moved to San Francisco in 1872. 1905 or 1906, Archbishop Tikhon transferred it to New York. And Holy Trinity Cathedral, or rather St. Nicholas Cathedral, was built, and you had a very active church. And there was this vision of unity, of cooperation between all the various ethnic ministries, but they were all seen as ministries of the one church. There was still a sense of Catholicity. And that Catholicity is precisely the thing that probably suffered the most over the next century. And that Catholic vision is a sense of the church completely transcending ethnicity, transcending race, national origin, language, that the church is simply the church for everyone, that we're citizens of the kingdom of heaven, first and foremost, not of any particular nation, not of any particular ethnicity, but our true citizenship is the kingdom of heaven. So in 1918 or 1917, in March, there was the abdication of the Tsar and the institution of the provisional government, and that's when the funding began, or that's when the funding ended for the church from Russia. It had been essentially an imperial project. But that funding had been critical to the American mission. That's what paid not only for churches, but it paid for salaries for the priests. It paid for the programs. It paid for the publications. It paid for travel. It paid for missions. And at that time, the church was all composed almost entirely of new immigrants. There were very few second generation or first generation born in America Orthodox, yet at least who were adults. It was all immigrants, many of whom made very low wages. And so it was a huge struggle, but the people persevered, even back in the 19th century, and up through the 20th century. A lot of the parishes, the Carpatho-Russians who composed a huge part of the American mission, because of all the uniats that had converted, they would make and sell pierogies. And so their churches were affectionately known as pierogi palaces. The people simply could not afford to donate large amounts of money to the church, and so they donated their labor. But the life of the church was established. It was going on, and it supported people. And the times, of course, were very difficult because of the people were because of the economic hardship. There was also persecution. There's a story that I was told by one elderly lady. This was already back when I was on the octet in 1987. We went to Deloge, Missouri, which is a little town way outside of St. Louis in the countryside, little country church. And this old woman remembered when she was a child, she and her whole family were chased through the fields by the Ku Klux Klan. They were rounded up and put on trains and sent out of town because they didn't want any of these foreigners in. And these were Carpatho-Russians. So our BLM friends have no monopoly on persecution. They should learn that. Anyway, there were all sorts of dynamics going on in various parts of the country. We talked about in Alaska the persecution that was state-sponsored by the United States of the native peoples in the name of educating their children. They were taken, put into these native schools, beaten harshly if they spoke their own language, deprived of their Orthodox faith, deprived of the ability to practice their faith, and even deprived of an Orthodox burial if and when they died. So it was quite a bitter thing. So the other thing about with 1917, we talked about the Great Council, didn't we? I believe the Great Council in 1917. Yeah. So much of the leadership of the American Church was over in Russia for that council, and which instituted some very important sorry, I just saw a text message. The council emphasized conciliarity. And conciliarity was kind of embodied in the pronouncements of the council by creating parish councils, diocesan councils, even an all-Russian council, which was composed not only of bishops, but of lay people and the clergy. You have this both in the OCA, which kind of still has taken it and run with it, but you also have it in the in ROCOR on a much lesser degree. Has much more power in the OCA than it does in ROCOR. And of course, it's also in the church in Russia. So this was one major reform. Another major reform was the calendar, which was voted on, but was never enacted because of the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, Saint Tikhon was elected the first patriarch of the restored patriarchate after the persecution by the Romanov dynasty. So there were important elements. Saint Tikhon was being enthroned as patriarch as the revolutionaries were seizing the Winter Palace, which was and holding the provisional government under siege. And it was so on one hand you had this very bright, positive thing going on in Moscow with the church, and then in St. Petersburg you had a revolutionary chaos. The execution of the new martyrs, of the clergy of the church, began almost immediately after the revolution, but I think we covered this with the confiscation of property and with the secularization of marriage, and a whole host of other anti-church legislation by the Bolsheviks. Of course, their goal was to destroy the church, destroy the family, and destroy civil society.
Sounds familiar.
It does.
Yeah, it does sound familiar. That's exactly like our Bolshevik friends.
Yep.
Right.
All.
Absolutely.
The only thing that's missing is the element of big business giving money to the Bolsheviks.
Well,
Oh,
no, it's not actually.
Really?
No, actually,
mhm.
what's his name?
Jacob Schiff.
Well, there was Jacob Schiff, but behind Jacob Schiff was Rockefeller. And Rockefeller and Standard Oil was trying to buy the Russian oil fields. And there were negotiations, but the Tsar denied it. He did not want to cede the Russian oil fields to Standard Oil. So this led Rockefeller to authorize his financier and financial advisor, who was Jacob Schiff, to send Lenin $20 million. $20 million is the
A lot of money.
Yeah, $2 billion today.
Wow.
And so that was, and then, so after the revolution, what happened? Lenin awards the contract for the Russian oil fields to Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Rockefeller and company liked the Bolsheviks anyway. So one has to wonder who one's friends are. Anyway, so you did have that, and then of course the Germans had financed Lenin to a huge degree, because this was still the middle of the First World War, and it was the Germans who financed Lenin's return to St. Petersburg. and were financing the revolution in order to take out Nicholas II. So you have all sorts of levels going on here.
Yep.
But back in America, what's happening? One of the head of the American Archdiocese at that time in 1917 was Archbishop Evlogi. He did not return to America, and so Archbishop Alexander Niemielowski was elected. At the same time, a Bishop Anthony came to America and became Bishop of Alaska, and Metropolitan Platon returned to America. He had been in America for quite a number of years, and then was sent back. He was a founding member of the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Church outside of Russia. At that time, he had been bishop of, I don't remember. Anyway, Platon had been bishop of a large city in Ukraine. After his first tour of duty in America, and then was in 1921 was sent back after having been involved in the synod meetings in which ROCOR was established, first in Constantinople, and then in Yugoslavia, in Srpski Karlovci, which ended up being the major see. During that synod meeting, there were other representatives from the American Church. There was Anthony of Alaska and Stephen of Pittsburgh. This is this is the council that issued the decrees about the restoration of monarchy and against socialism and communism, which created so much controversy. By 1922, Archbishop Alexander had incurred massive debt. He had had to mortgage many of the church properties in order to pay the salaries of the clergy. And so he decided to return to Europe. He appointed Platon to be the head of the American Church. In the next year, later on that year, in November, there was a Sabor, or an All-American Council, in Pittsburgh, where Platon was elected as the head of the American Church by the council, with the title Metropolitan of all America and Canada, which was my title also. St. Tikhon had approved this, but his approval had been conveyed by orally and not in writing, because at the time Tikhon was either under house arrest or in prison, and so there was normal communications were simply impossible. However, Platon made a huge mistake. He forged a letter from Patriarch Tikhon appointing him as the head of the American Church. This letter would come back to bite him because the Russian Church had sent over, the Russian Church, as the official highest church authority, was the living church, because the Bolsheviks rejected St. Tikhon and rejected the traditional Russian Orthodox Church, and instead gave their authorization as the official Church of Russia to the living church. Now, the living church was a group of basically super progressive clergy. They were allied with and subordinate to the Communist Party, but they had no popularity among the people. They were radical renovationists. So, for example, they wanted a married episcopate. They wanted to get rid of monasticism. There were some good ideas. They wanted to translate the liturgy into Russian. They also wanted the new calendar. But those ideas, at least for the next generation or two, are still going to be associated with these renovationist schismatics. There was even a group of them that wanted to pull down the iconostas and pull the altar out into the center of the church. So wow. It would have been a renovation of the church more radical than Vatican II, and 50 years earlier, which is quite interesting.
Master,
yes.
Did the living church have any authority, or were they self-appointing themselves?
Well, they basically were given authority by the Bolsheviks. So the real Russian Orthodox Church under Patriarch Tikhon and the Synod of the Bishops of under him was declared illegal, and the living church was authorized in legal terms as the official Russian Orthodox Church, which meant that all properties that belonged to the Russian Orthodox Church were now in the hands of the living church. This goes also with the old practice of corporation sole. Now the Roman Catholic Church operates according to this principle. Certain Orthodox jurisdictions operate according to this principle. It means all property is vested in the name of the bishop. So all the churches, all the rectories, all the parish halls, all the schools, all the universities, everything is vested in the name of the local bishop. This is why, for example, during the gay scandals or the pedophile scandals of the 80s, 90s, whatever it was, the Catholic Church was so bitterly affected and would sell off parishes because they were being sued, and in order to settle these lawsuits, they had to capitalize their real estate. Well, those were parish churches. So in that system, of course, the people don't own their own church. So that was a very bitter thing. So the living church sent a guy named John Kudrowski, supposedly a bishop, to take over the property of the church. He was married, and the people rejected him. He had all these renovationist ideas, and fought very hard to take control of the Russian American mission. So the church was plunged into all sorts of litigation. On a practical level, what this did is it forced all the parishes to incorporate separately. So the church dropped this model of corporation sole in the name of the bishop, and each parish became its own corporation with the title to the property vested in the board of trustees of the bishop could not take the property. And this is, this is a very important thing in the life of the American Church, even today, both in the OCA and in ROCOR, because most of those properties are completely independently owned and operated by the parishes. And it also makes it easier that way to jump jurisdictions. Now, up until 1917, there were no jurisdictions to jump to. There was only the one Russian Orthodox mission in America. That was the canonical church in America. And all the parishes belonged to it. And many of the parishes had been financed by it with money from the Tsar. That, however, had ceased. And so not only were the parishes having to mortgage their properties, they now had to incorporate. Unfortunately, many of them went to Protestant lawyers who simply used Protestant forms of incorporation, and that created a mess. And so up through the 90s, and even into the 2000s, some of these churches still had very, very negative bylaws. So the main, probably the most visible of these legal cases was for St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City on 97th Street. You know, it's a beautiful cathedral consecrated by St. Tikhon, built by St. John Kucherov, and it was hotly contested by Kudrowski. And this is where the that fake letter of appointment that Platon had created backfired on him, because it was judged to be an obvious fraud, and so that threw the case to Kudrowski. So the Living Church got that property. Later on, 5 or 6 years later, with more difficult circumstances, which we'll talk about, the Moscow Patriarchate received that church. So neither Platon's community nor, well, at this point, Platon was still in ROCOR. Neither of them were able to use it. There was still another group. One of the bishops who had been in that synod by the name of Stephen, who had been a former Uniate priest, consecrated Bishop Adam Filipovsky as Bishop of Canada. The next year, 1923, because Platon's credentials were very shaky, Stephen declared himself the acting head of the American Church. And he convened a synod of bishops and announced that Bishop Adam would succeed him as the bishop of the Carpatho-Russians, and that he would become the archbishop. Now, the next year, Stephen participated in a major sabor, a major council, and then returned to the Uniates. 1924, Platon calls the American diocese called a sabor, an all-American council in Detroit in March and April. At this sabor, this is a one of the landmark events in the history of the Russian Church in America. Platon was confirmed as the Metropolitan and tasked with the creation of a charter to structure the church in America. However, this was done as the church declared itself autonomous. Actually, it declared itself self-governing, which also usually means autocephalous. This was the first attempt of the American diocese to declare autocephaly. Autocephaly is a very important status, but really it's only appropriate if a church is very mature. If it has seminaries, if it has monasteries, if it has institutions, and it has many parishes, and it embraces all of the Orthodox Christians in the given region. So Platon's title of Metropolitan of all America and Canada, which is still used by the OCA Metropolitan, means that he is the criterion, that Metropolitan is the canonical criterion for all Orthodox bishops in America. And every Orthodox Christian should be under his amaphorion. Now, that doesn't work with multiple jurisdictions. So this whole thing really became a fiasco from 1924, if not earlier. What he really wanted with autocephaly or autonomy was independence both from the Russian Orthodox Church as well as from the synod abroad. And they really weren't thinking in terms of the other Orthodox communities that were in America, which were basically flailing around at the time, wondering what these Russians were up to. At the Detroit Sobor, the Russian diocese renamed itself as the American Orthodox Church, which had spiritual ties and communion with the church in Russia, but no administrative and no canonical ties. This was a disaster. At first, the Rocor Synod supported Metropolitan Platon. They supported him by denying Bishop Adams' claims to be the leader of the American Church. And so this was the same year and then the same Sobor in which Evlogi departed from the synod. Platon was there as well. And this is where Evlogi walked out and he joined Moscow at that point. Underneath all of this, there's a constant theme of the nature of the relationship of the churches, both the Synod of Bishops of the Church abroad, headquartered in Yugoslavia, but having archdioceses in Western Europe, in North America, in the Far East, and one other. not yet Australia, and Southern Europe, basically. It was at this synod in 1924, if you remember that Evlogi, who had been in discussions with the Moscow Patriarchate behind the backs of the bishops of Rokor, of the Synod of Rokor, decided to go over to them. The underlying theme that runs through this whole time is the question of not only the relationship with the the Patriarchate in Moscow, but what are the what is necessary in order to have that relationship, and what was being demanded by the Russian Orthodox Church was an oath of loyalty to the Soviet power of all the clergy. Of course, they couldn't demand that of the lay people. But Evlogi decided that to sign that oath of loyalty. And so he, for a short period of time, took his entire jurisdiction into Moscow. Now, this was the same time as Patriarch Tikhon, Saint Tikhon, was dying. He died on April 7th, in other words, the Feast of the Annunciation, in 1925, under questionable circumstances. Many think that he was murdered. He had previously found the body of his Kellenic, who had been murdered on the stairs to his apartment, and he had been essentially under house arrest at Donskoy Monastery for several years, basically unable to fulfill the tasks of the administration of the church. Most of the bishops, those that hadn't been shot, most of the bishops had been put into prison, sent to the Gulag. Many had been killed. Most of the churches had been closed. Most of the properties had been confiscated, and all the sacred items and all the valuable items of the churches had been looted or taken by the government and sold. And you can see some of them in the museum right near St. John's Cathedral. What's it called?
Hillwood.
Hillwood, yes. They have quite a collection of Russian liturgical art, which had been looted from the churches of Moscow. Then, after Saint Tikhon's repose, there was a whole series of it's called the locum tenens, the placeholder, which is what the word means, who were occupying the patriarchal throne and trying to conduct the business of the church. Of course, it was in a very hostile environment. Most of them ended up being killed or martyred. Finally, they came to Metropolitan Sergius Stragorodsky. Now, he was a very interesting person, and he had been a missionary in Japan, was very well known for his missionary work, and had very much followed in the footsteps of Saint Innocent as a missionary, and who had inspired and trained St. Nikolai of Japan, and he had picked up this same kind of advisory missionary work that St. Nikolai of Japan had in Japan. So he was a highly respected person. And basically, you know, the church was in radical, absolute existential crisis. And so he made a declaration which in some ways it lightened the persecution of the church. It also led to the demise of the living church and the recognition by the Soviet power of the patriarchal church, even though there was no patriarch at this point. The declaration, which was issued on July 16th of 1927, fundamentally altered the course of the Moscow Patriarchate. I'll read it. In its central passage, it stated that Russian Orthodox believers need to show not in words but in deeds that not only people indifferent to Orthodoxy or those who reject it may be faithful citizens of the Soviet Union, loyal to the Soviet government, but likewise the most fervent adherents of Orthodoxy, to whom it is as precious with all its canonical and liturgical treasures as truth and life. We wish to remain Orthodox and at the same time to recognize the Soviet Union as our civil fatherland, whose joys and successes are our joys and successes, and whose misfortunes are our misfortunes. Every blow directed against the Union we acknowledge as a blow directed against us. Remaining Orthodox, we regard it as our duty to be citizens of the Union, not from fear, but from conscience, as the Apostle has taught us. And we are hopeful that with God's help, by our mutual cooperation and support, we shall accomplish that task. Later on, he talks about the emigre clergy, the church abroad. The problem of the emigre clergy under these circumstances is especially poignant. The openly anti-Soviet actions of some archpastors and pastors, greatly detrimental to the relations between the government and the church, have forced the late patriarch, as is known, to depose the synod abroad in 1922. Nevertheless, the synod has continued to exist hitherto and has not changed its politics. Moreover, by its pretensions to rule, it has lately divided the ecclesiastical community abroad into two camps. In order to put an end to this state of affairs, we demanded from the clergy abroad a written promise of their complete loyalty to the Soviet government in all their public activities. Those who fail to make such a promise or to observe it shall be expelled from the ranks of the clergy subject to the Moscow Patriarchate. We think that having set up such limits, we shall be secure against all unexpected happenings abroad. On the other hand, our demand may perhaps cause many to pause and consider whether the time has not come to revise their attitudes towards the Soviet regime so as not to be cut off from their native church and land. So that, those were fighting words so far as the bishops of the church abroad. Of course, it was questionable whether Patriarch Tikhon had actually written that letter deposing them in 1922, as they had acted under his authority, and certainly later actions of by him towards them would indicate that he did not acknowledge that letter. However, this declaration by Metropolitan Sergius became the basis for the church abroad's very existence to continue the mission of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, to support especially the emigres and the external dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church, which were cut off from union with the Mother Church because of the communists. Of course, the Russian Church abroad, from that time on, and previously as well, but especially from this, became one of the most fervent anti-communist organizations in the world, and one of the most zealous workers against communism. However, it was also on this basis that people did question the canonical legitimacy of the church abroad, because it had been, it was now formally in schism from its mother church. So that was 1927.
May I ask you a question about schismatics?
Uh-huh.
While all this was going on, somehow in Siberia, the old believers survived. And I think they were always seen as schismatics. And my other question was, did any schismatic, old believer, schismatic so-called, come to North America?
Well, many of them did. And there's large communities in various places, specifically in the Portland, Oregon area. There's a large number of old believers. And in Alaska, there are large groups of old believers. Many of them have gone back to Russia now, that there's freedom. And there's also a very strong movement to reconcile them to the patriarchal church. So, on the other hand, there's also groups of old believers that are that have no clergy, they have no bishops, they have no priests, hence they have no sacraments, and some of them are pretty set in their ways. So we'll see. We'll see what happens there. Are there other questions?
Were there, could you clarify, so there was the church loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate, and there was Rokor, and then who else was active abroad in the US, or other Russians who were not part of either group?
Well, at first, it depends on where in the, before 1917, the Russian church had external dioceses, churches and bishops, full dioceses, certainly in North America, and also in Western Europe. It had churches in China and other places in the Far East. When the after the Bolshevik coup and the the church became essentially was imprisoned under the communist yoke. You still had these external dioceses, and they had been instructed by the patriarch to organize their lives separately until normal communication could resume. And most of the external dioceses added not only until normal communication could resume, but until the church in Russia was no longer under the influence of the government, under the communist government. So in the early 20s, you had in America, let's go with Europe first. In Europe, you had the bishops of the Russian Church abroad, which basically oversaw all of the parishes of Western Europe. They are all of the parishes in Europe. They had a diocese. They appointed Evlogi to be the bishop, but he was also one of the founding members of the Russian Church abroad. So it was basically the kind of ruling synod for Western Europe, as well as for the Russian Orthodox churches, which had been the Russian American mission, the multi-ethnic, multi-ethnic mission as it had been set up by Saint Tikhon prior, in the early 1900s. In 1924, Evlogi broke off from the church abroad, but there were still churches that remained faithful to the church abroad. So the Russian church bifurcated in Europe to the Evlogi faction, which tended to be more modernist. At first they went back under Moscow, and then they ended up eventually going under Constantinople. And just recently, last year, they have returned to Moscow. And then in America, you had the American mission. Platon was appointed the head of the American mission in the early 1922. And the American church organized its own life, but starting in 1924, the unity began to be undermined. Now, so far as the broader Orthodox community, at first, of course, everybody was still together under Metropolitan Platon. But then, and we'll get to this, all the various ethnic jurisdictions started to fragment. And so, for example, you had Platon going in and out of relationship with the Russian church, with the Synod of Bishops of the church abroad. And then because of Platon's own stupidity, I don't know what else, and by forging a document, he compromised his authority for the church in America. Then in 1924, at the same time as Evlogi is conducting negotiations with Moscow, Platon is working to take the American church autonomous. But it was more than just autonomy, it was almost autocephaly. Because ultimately they didn't want to be under the authority either of Moscow or of the Synod abroad. Then there was that schism within the Synod of the American Church, of Bishop Stephen and Bishop Adam, both of whom ended up back in the Unions. And then Platon is rebuked by the Bishops' Council in 1926. 1926, he's in Yugoslavia at the Bishops' Council, and he makes a speech where he proclaims himself an enemy of the independence and autocephaly of the church in America, and he swears his submission to Metropolitan Peter of Krutitsa, who is the locum tenens of the Patriarchal See, and the Synod of Rochor, but he refused to sign it in writing, and he walked out. And so and so as a result, the Bishops' Council condemned the Detroit Council, the Detroit All-American Council, and its decree of autocephaly. In turn, under Platon's direction, the American bishops replied to Rocor that Rocor was uncanonical and their decisions had no canonical significance. 1927, the American bishops drafted a letter that Rocor was and demanded all the bishops to sign that Rocor was uncanonical. Well, there was a new bishop by the name of Apolinari, and he refused to sign it. He refused to deny the validity of the Synod of Bishops of Rocor. So as a result, Rocor suspended Platon and appointed Apolinari as head of the American Orthodox mission. However, 90% of the churches and the people stayed with Platon. This was the beginning of the division between what became the Metropolia and the parishes of Rocor. So, for example, the old cathedral in San Francisco, where Bishop James is, was bought in that year for Bishop Apolinari to have a church, because the main cathedral, which was on Green Street, was taken over by Platon's people. So the whole thing turned into a mess. On one hand, you have Rocor calling it the Platonite schism, and on the other hand, you have the Platonites calling Rocor uncanonical. So following those events, Platon and company suspended Apolinari. Of course, they'd already gone into schism from one another. This is the beginning of the fragmentation. Now, it wasn't for a couple more years that actually in 1933, that Moscow would send Bishop Benjamin Fedchenko. He had served in the White Army and then became Dean of Saint-Serge Theological Institute in Paris. He had disagreed with Evlogi and broken with him, and remained faithful to and went back to the Patriarchate. Starting in the 30s, Benjamin was working to try and reconcile these various groups of exile clergy, both the Platon's people as well as Apolinari, in other words, the Metropolia, as well as Rocor, to Moscow. But the central requirement was an oath of loyalty to the Soviet government. And that went over like a lead balloon, because the Americans, and by this time, especially by 1930 or so, many of the priests were either refugees from Russia, exiles, or they were American born. And they weren't about to sign some kind of loyalty oath to the Soviet government. With Benjamin Fedchenko, whereas the living church had disappeared basically by this time, Benjamin begins to create the institution that's now called the parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, eventually all of this was healed. And in 2007, Rokor reconciled with Moscow. And so now we're an archdiocese, an autonomous archdiocese within the Moscow Patriarchate. So the past is put in the past. And the Metropolia, which is which are the Platonites, are the OCA, and they had reconciled with Moscow in 1970. But as you can see, it's taken a long, long time. Rokor reconciled with Moscow in 2007, but Rokor and the OCA didn't reconcile until 2010. I can show you pictures of that because it was Metropolitan Hilarion and me. The church became, not only was the very Catholic consciousness of the church just destroyed by all of this nonsense, and the church was basically reduced to feuding ethnic factions. It's all of those, those ethnic factions were then divided themselves between those who wanted to be under their mother church, regardless of the communists, and those who were avid anti-communists, and those who wanted to have a relationship with the mother church, but didn't want to have anything to do with it jurisdictionally or politically. So those were the three divisions in the Russian Orthodox community in this country, which are the Moscow Patriarchate, the OCA, and Rokor. The Serbs were divided between the patriarchal Serbs, which acknowledged the patriarch of Serbia despite the fact of the communist domination, and then the Free Serbs, which completely rejected the hierarchy of the church because of the communist domination. You had the Romanians, and the Romanians are still divided. The Serbs are back together. The Romanians are still divided. You have the patriarchal Romanians, and which is in this country is about 50 or 60 parishes, give or take. And then you have the other part of the Romanian church, where the founding Archbishop ended up being deported for being a Nazi. But they
Is he Ukrainian?
No, Romanian.
Romanian. Okay.
Romanian. And so, but there's about 110, 120 parishes of the Romanian episcopate in the OCA.
Vladika, could I just, one reason I wanted to take this class is I'm new to Orthodoxy and I'm trying to understand. Of course, I come from a background, not just the Episcopal Church, but all the continuing Anglican movements, which are very confusing, more confusing than that of the Orthodox, maybe.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I'm still trying to understand Rokor and OCA and the differences. And I know you're firsthand have a lot of experience with that, but can you explain that to a neophyte in 5 minutes? Because I just don't grasp it.
Well, explain the OCA. Well, the OCA was the OCA is this Platonite group, the followers of Metropolitan Platon, and a whole series of others, and we'll get into some interesting material on that, but who have been essentially who had been pushing for complete independence since the 20s. They didn't want to be under any old world hierarchy. Now, it wasn't until the 70s or 80s even that Slavonic ceased to be the main language in the OCA. It was still the main language when I was starting out, but it had well, there's a lot that I could say.
Is it an oversimplification to say at one point in time OCA was perhaps more rightist and ROCOR was more leftist, and they've almost changed places?
Well, the OCA, no, that would be a way oversimplification. ROCOR has always been monarchist and remains monarchist, actually, to a great extent. For many years, the ideology behind ROCOR was that the exiles would return and help to restore, not just restore Orthodoxy to Russia, but restore the whole imperial regime as it had existed. Because when they came here, they didn't think the Bolsheviks would last for more than a few years. They didn't expect 75. The OCA came out of that, to a large extent, out of those unions that that converted, and then on top of that, there were these other large immigrations that eventually got integrated into the OCA. For many years, the OCA was deemed schismatic, not only by the Russian Orthodox Church, but by ROCOR, and it was completely canonically isolated from 1946 until 1970. In fact, most of the churches weren't even in communion with the OCA. And it was, those were hard times for the OCA. In the 60s, they began a series of conversations. Because of the ecumenical movement, they had access to the higher clergy of the Russian Church. And at ecumenical meetings, they began to meet with Metropolitan Nicodeme of Leningrad, who gradually began to work a reconciliation of them with Moscow. Finally, in 1970, they were actually given, it was a kind of double thing. One, they were reconciled. All of the bans, the excommunications, the defrockings were all lifted, and then Moscow declared the Metropolia, as it was called at the time, to be an autocephalous church. It was done so with the idea that autocephaly would be the basis for unity for all of the churches in America. That failed. It failed very quickly because none of the other churches were interested. Each of them wanted to control their own show, and they certainly did not want to go under the synod of the OCA or even join it. So it was but even at that time, even the main church meetings, the so-called All-American Councils, were conducted in Russian. So there still remained, even in the beginning of the OCA, a sense that it was part of that history of its being the Russian Orthodox mission. That soon faded away, And so by the 70s, it was largely an English-speaking church, and starting in the 70s, converts began to come into the church, so that now it's probably 60% converts, and 75% of the clergy, including the Metropolitan and the previous Metropolitan, me, were also converts to the faith. So there was a lot of promise for the OCA. And I'll stop there. The directions that it's gone over the past few years are not something that I approve of, shall we say.
Well, my first shock, I think, was 2016. After the election, I was in Dallas, went to the cathedral, and it was the Sunday after the election, and they gave a very political sermon, and it was not tilted towards the newly elected president-elect. I was just taken aback.
Well, I believe that was the new bishop of Dallas.
Yes.
Yes, and who I've known for 35 years. And who is, shall we say, rather far to the left of center. Now the cathedral is not.
We reverently bowed and left the cathedral. So.
Yeah, but the people of the cathedral were horrified, quite frankly, because they're Texans. That didn't fly down there. So
he sounded more like Pope Francis than he did an Orthodox bishop.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It didn't help.
Well, I don't want to lure you further into that area. I just
yeah. So, are there other questions?
I was wondering about the icons and other objects that were formerly in churches that are now in museums. Mm-hmm. Do the Orthodox want them back? Is it like these ethnological collections that, I mean, they were looted. They may have been sold fair and square at the time, but they were taken from churches, and I was wondering if they want them back.
Well, some of them do. Some of the great treasures, like the Rublev Trinity and the Vladimir, they're very fragile, and they're seen as national treasures. So they're in like the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God. The museum actually opened a church in the museum. Oh. And so some of these great icons are actually displayed in the church. And you can go up and you can light candles and things like that, which you can't exactly do in a museum, usually. But for the most part, remember, there were probably, I don't know, probably 100,000 churches in Russia. By the time, by the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990 or thereabouts, there were 4,000 left. And the rest of them were in ruins, or they had been converted into factories and warehouses and movie theaters. And one was converted into an ice rink, and of course they had been stripped. Now most of a lot of the rural churches, the people themselves had taken the icons and had hidden them and kept them for safekeeping. When the Bolsheviks got to them first, though, a lot of times they were just destroyed. The great cathedrals in Moscow, which were very richly adorned, there was a decree by the Soviet government that in order to alleviate famine in Ukraine, the churches had to give up all of their precious metalwork, silver and gold, so that it could be melted down and sold in order to feed the poor. So they were trying, they were playing the, and so what happened is most of that material was put into warehouses and sold by the kilo, and that's how Mrs. Meriwether Post got a hold of all of that stuff.
I've seen that collection. Her husband was notoriously pro-Soviet.
Yeah. Well, so was the United States.
Yeah.
The United States supported Lenin. And of course, that was Woodrow Wilson. So he was a fellow traveler. And then under Roosevelt, he was another communist, well, socialist.
Yeah.
So.
And you had other people very close to Stalin, like Armand Hammer was a great fence of all Russian treasures, national treasures.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank God some of them appreciated some of the religious art, but a lot of it was just sold for, what we would say was pennies on the dollar, and or just destroyed. What else? I'm in a good stopping place in my lecture. So what other because the next topic is fairly long. It's it was a this group under Platon decided to create an American Orthodox Church, and they took one of their bishops, the Syrian bishop, whose name was Efthymios Ophaish, and he was put in charge of creating this new synod and this new church, and they declared themselves autocephalous and announced it to all of the other local churches in the world, all the autocephalous churches. Of course, it was completely rejected and turned into a fiasco. But most things did during this time. There's another aspect of what was going on was there had been this Greek archimandrite by the name of Miletos Metexakis, who had been traveling around the United States, visiting Greek communities, trying to consolidate them, and trying to bring them into a united jurisdiction. He went and got himself made Patriarch of Constantinople. I don't know how much he paid to do that, but it's always been for sale, at least for the past 500-600 years. So he had himself made Patriarch of Constantinople. And in 1923, he called a council. And so he built it as a committee, but he also then tried to pass it off as a council because it made some rather earth-shaking decisions. There was actually a representative there briefly from Rocor. Rocor told him it couldn't be a council because how could you have a council without the participation of the Russian church? Which also should echo this last fiasco that Constantinople tried to pull off in Crete. Anyway, this council that Metexakis convened did some radical reforms. He instituted the new calendar, and thereby he divided the Church of Greece so that 25% or even up to 50% at one time went off into schism and refused to accept the new calendar. They began to revise the canons on marriage. And this is marriage and remarriage of clergy. There was a desire on the part of many of the clergy in the Balkan churches to be able to remarry usually after the death of their wives. Of course, this is contrary to canon law. However, Metexakis included this, and they voted for that clergy could be remarried after the death of their spouse. This was never fully implemented, although it began to be a kind of a variation in the use of economia, that some bishops would be more lenient with this in regards to economia than others. One of the other things that was very important in this is that although there was a Rokor bishop there, Miletus Metexakis did not recognize Patriarch Tikhon as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. They recognized and supported the living church. So you have a strong liberal, modernist, renovationist agenda in Constantinople from the 20s. And Metexakis had also made a pronouncement as patriarch, which has continued to plague the Orthodox world and is the basis of many of the problems that have happened recently with the Patriarchate of Constantinople, where he gave an interpretation of Canon 28 of the Council of Chalcedon and said that all lands, all peoples not under the jurisdiction of one of the traditional patriarchates are under him, are under the ecumenical patriarchate. So, for example, they declared that the Russian jurisdiction in America was illegitimate because it wasn't under them. Now, it didn't matter that that was 1923 when he made that declaration, and the Russian Orthodox Church had been in America since 1794. But you know, what's a little history here? So this continues to be a huge issue in the Orthodox world. So
I have a question about another issue. I'm sorry to prolong if anybody wants to leave, but I read this in the spring during the COVID crisis, I guess, when we were all secluded. I read the Father Seraphin Rose biography by Damascene, and then I read the Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future and a few other things like that. So I was at the church in Somerville, South Carolina on Sunday with Father Anastasi, who I like very much. He's great. And very entertaining, what have you. A lot of people there. And we had a meal afterwards, despite all the COVID stuff. And so I made a comment about that because I saw a DVD of St. John of San Francisco. I think St. John of San Francisco and St. John of Singapore are the same saint. Is that right?
I don't know about Singapore, but St. John of San Francisco is very significant.
Well, he just commented. He said, he said, you can borrow this. I said, can I buy it? He said, you can borrow it. He said, but you need to know that he was off in his theology, and so was Father Seraphin Rose, and I need to explain all that to you. And I said, all right, that's fine. We'll do that next time. But the one thing I picked up from the biography of Father Seraphin Rose is this intense group within the American Orthodox Church that was intent on, he never really explains it. He talks about super correctness.
Right.
And I got a whiff of that in that conversation, but I didn't pursue it. And I just said, fine, we'll talk about that next time. And I make no pretenses to be a theological authority, but I just found it interesting because he definitely, he took not umbrage, but it was sort of like, why do you want this on Father St. John of San Francisco, and why do you like Seraph and Rose so much? I just read the books, you know, but it impressed me greatly.
Uh-huh. Well, there's
I'm just saying, I don't know what he was talking about.
Right. Well, in the 1960s, partly thanks to St. John of Shanghai, San Francisco.
Shanghai. Yeah.
You have.
I didn't mean Singapore. I meant Shanghai.
Okay. Yeah. Rocor got involved with the Greek Old Calendarists, actually starting in the 50s, and it took into its jurisdiction Transfiguration Monastery in Brookline, Massachusetts, which was the kind of major center of a lot of the kind of zealotry and of a kind of an attitude of being super correct. And so everybody was judged as to whether they were Orthodox enough. And this crept into parts of Rocor.
What does it mean? What does it mean?
Basically, it's a typical convert kind of temptation to judge other people whether they are truly Orthodox, whether they're Orthodox enough, and of course, people will never measure up. So, for example, they would say, well, you know, the new calendarists are utterly without grace. You know, they're not really Orthodox. They just look, you know, they do some Orthodox things, but, you know, they're not really Orthodox. They're just Protestants.
Okay.
And things like that. Then that spilled over to the Rocor Metropolitan, Filaret, who was wont to say that the Moscow Patriarchate was without grace, which is a pretty severe judgment. Now that was him personally, not as an official position, but it's a very you know, it's a very brutal thing. And what it did was it created this whole kind of mood in certain places in Rocor. Most of the Russians were horrified at all of that stuff, but there were these convert ghettos, of which Platina had been a major leader in creating this convert movement within Rocor. And so by the late 70s, they realized that what they were doing by nurturing this kind of, you know, harsh, bitter, judgmental attitude was very detrimental, and that it was not contributing to people's salvation. In fact, exactly the opposite. And so, so Platina turned away from that and began to try to fight against it. Father Seraphim Rose in particular, because there was nothing sober about it. It was a very difficult period. But what it did was it forced Rocor into deep isolation from the rest of the Orthodox churches in America. Which is never good.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading, knowing more about St. John of Shanghai. And I can tell you, Father Seraphim Rose was just a holy man.
Yes.
And I didn't come to Orthodoxy to be judged. I'm going to let God judge me. I came as you would come to a hospital for souls. So I don't understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a big temptation, essentially, at that time. And Father Seraphim, because ultimately his spiritual maturity prevailed, and he saw through the temptation and started working against it. So eventually, Rocor jettisoned the Greek old calendarists, and then of course the Greek old calendarists condemned Rocor after we reconciled with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Well, thank you for that explanation, because truthfully, I didn't understand it.
Yeah, that's one of those difficult periods in church history.
But it's not completely dead, apparently. So.
Oh no. No. But it's not like it was 30 years ago.
Okay. But I'll have the discussion with Father Anastasi and let you know how that goes.
Okay. Very good. So does anybody else have any questions or comments?
Yeah, this is Frank. Would you say that the Greek old calendarists, it was interesting you mentioned among the Greek church, the upset at the reforms that Constantinople imposed without really anyone's consent.
Right.
Up to half of them were broke with Constantinople. But so out of that is what became the old calendarists, I guess. The
right.
Greek old, but then they've had a number of schisms in their own ranks, and
yep.
I have listened to them on YouTube. I don't know a lot, but I just, they term all of the other Orthodox, all of them, schismatics and heretics. But if you listen to the content of the critique, they'll say, well, look at what many Orthodox do, so-called Greek Orthodox and others. They have pews in their churches, or, you know, they don't study their catechism enough, or it's, you know, people, just things like that don't, you know, or it's on old calendar versus new calendar, but that's still an issue. But like putting pews in the church, I mean, Rocor doesn't have them. I think it's maybe a discipline, but to get into say that's a matter of doctrine is kind of far afield.
Right, and the thing is, the old calendarists, you know, I mean, there's some very good and some very holy people among them, actually. But there are also frauds, and the old calendarists, or the old calendar movement, I won't, you know, and there are multiple synods and groups of old calendarists, and, you know, some are more Orthodox than God, and some of them are more Orthodox than, you know, and their main issue now is ecumenism. That's which is, they go off on endlessly. Of course, they have a good point, actually.
What is the issue now, Ladika?
Pardon?
I didn't hear you said what the issue is now.
Ecumenism.
Humanism. Yeah.
In other words, it's not just the dialogue with non-Orthodox churches, but it's the especially the organized institutional ecumenism, the World Council, the National Council, all of these things.
National prayer breakfast, all of that business.
That really doesn't figure into it as much, okay, because that's more political than it is
religious.
Religious, yeah. But it's what, you know, it's like the agenda. Ultimately, the agenda of the World Council was to kind of become a pan-Protestant, the unification of all of the Protestant churches into one. But what it does is it completely relativizes all the doctrine It complete and on the whole, and underlying it is Marxism.
Yeah.
And it has a very strong Marxist agenda to it, and always has from the very beginning. And this is a very serious issue. So over the past 40, 50 years, they've spent most of their energy putting out all of these kind of radical left-wing social pronouncements. And they jump on every left-wing bandwagon. You know, they're leaders of the whole LGBT movement. They're leaders of probably undoubtedly, they're main supporters of Black Lives Matter. You name it, they're into it. Now, Protestants are going to do what Protestants are going to do, but the Orthodox are involved as well. And this is a very problematic thing. After we turn off the recording, I can tell you some of my own personal reflections.
Well, let's turn it off.
You want it turned off now?
Okay,
Yeah,
let's pray first.
Thanks, Frank.
Let's pray first. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and into ages of ages.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.